Hello, welcome to the National Research Center, Mass Communication and Journalism Department of Tezpur University. I am SISIR Basu, Professor in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Banaras Hindu University, Varanasi. Today, we are going to talk about development communication. In the first lecture, I will be talking about the genesis, that means the beginning of development communication, and the main contours, main themes, main thoughts of development communication. And in my next lecture, I will be talking about some of the criticism, pointing out what the critics have said about development communication, and a kind of assessment that we would like to do in my next lecture. So, let us begin. Let us talk about the beginning of development communication. In two of my previous lectures, one on communication, beginning of communication, the other one was the genesis of communication research. I have said that, emphasized rather, that this communication discipline began in an earnest during Second World War and after Second World War. If we see the genesis or the beginning of development communication, it began during that time. In university departments, development communication in India is quite popular. We know it as DC, so development communication. It started as a project to spread the news that through development communication or through communication, particularly through radio, messages of development can be spread around. And from that concept, the development communication has come about. In fact, this concept of development communication is a soft weapon that was employed by the USA powers that be to influence the third world countries or developing countries to come to its fold. So, development communication as an area of study came with a tag. With a tag means it was promoted by a particular thought, by particular political approach, and it was also channeled through educational institution, like many universities started the subject area of development communication, and also many scholars came forward to give it a theoretical frame. It was also given in the university level as an area of study. Now, if we go deeper into when it began and all, we see the seminal work of Daniel Lerner. He wrote a book called The Passing of the Traditional Society, Modernizing the Middle East. Now, many people would be asking why in the Middle East. Daniel Lerner conducted some studies in that area, and he thought of putting all his findings in the form of a book, a kind of a thesis in which he propounded, he said that development communication is the weapon by which traditional societies can be helped to become modernized. So, Lerner wrote this book in 1958, and his study was based in a village called Balgat in Turkey. Now, he visited this place a couple of times, means 2 times. When he visited this Balgat village in Turkey for the first time, he did not see any development, and for him development was road, asphalt road, buses, electricity, running water, and all those things. He did not find anything of that sort. He found that people were more involved in agriculture. They had herd of sheep to look after, and to grow food and vegetable in the land that they had. So, for him this was a traditional society it had no intention of becoming modern. But during his second visit, he visited that place I think after 2 or 3 years, and he found a lot of changes in that. So, in that village. So, he saw that that Balghat village was on its way to become modernized. He saw running buses, electricity was already there were running water systems, there were refrigerators and about 100 radio sets, and people used to listen to radio. For him, these were the parameters for development. So, he thought that Balghat was a village which was a traditional village, but was moving through the help of communication, through the help of radio broadcast, and was becoming modernized. Now, in his thesis, that is in his book, he has categorized the villagers into 3 types. One type was traditionalist. He found that many people did not leave their old habit, old way of living. So, he called them traditionalists, and for him that these people would never become modernized. So, he thought that they could be categorized, that means they would leave the world by being or by remaining traditionalist. The second one, he found that some people were there, the second type, he called them modernist. That means these people were already becoming modern, like they have left their traditional clothings, they were wearing western clothes, they were listening to radio, they were moving by running buses in their houses, they had already the running water, the piped water as we say. So, he called them modernist. That means they were ready and they were already leaving their old way of life and moving to a modern way of life. And the third category, who were in between traditionalists and modernists, he called them transitionalists. That means those who were not yet modern and those who were about to leave the traditional way of life and move to the modern way of life. He called them transitionalists. For him, they were the hope. So, the first one, the type is called traditionalists. So, they would never become modern. The second group was already modern, and the third one was on its way to become modern. So, almost he could establish by almost 66% of the villagers would eventually become modern. That is, out of 3 groups, 2 groups were already there. Now, this really influenced many people who were into development projects, those who were taking policy decisions. They thought that radio and communication was a potent force to change the traditional villages or traditional way of life and help people to become modern. And in 1964, keeping that track, Wilbur Schramm wrote a book called Mass Media and National Development, which also became very famous, a kind of a Bible we say, like Daniel Lerner's Passing of the Traditional Society. The scholars, the researchers, the policy makers, they were reading these 2 books. So, Mass Media and National Development in 1964 was written by Wilbur Schramm. Later, he of course revised this book in 1979, and it pointed out 12 areas of influence that mass media could have on the society. So, this book is still there, and many departments pick it up, these 2 books, because they are the foundational book for the concept of development communication. Now, when Wilbur Schramm talked about that 12 areas of influences that media could have, we can broadly categorize them or club them, these 12 influences, into 3 major categories. One was that the media had the ability to educate people. So, education was one. There are many ways people could be educated by media. The second group could be clubbed as to inform. So, information was something just to impart information, that was one category. To educate was one category, and the third one was helping people, encouraging people to participate in the development projects. So, participation was necessary. Then people would be thinking that the projects that were there with the intention of development, if they participate in that, they will be thinking that that is their project and not somebody else's project. So, broadly, Schramm's 12 points of influences could be categorized into three broad types. One was to inform, the second one was to educate, and the third one was encouraging the people or the recipients of the fruits of development to participate in all the projects. Now, as this was going on, what we have seen that United Nations through UNESCO also jumped into this flow of development communication. They have come up with a kind of a norm. They said that for each 100 people, there should be 10 copies of newspaper, there should be 2 radio sets and 2 cinema seats. That means you can imagine that at that time when they were talking about development communication, late 50s, early 60s, for every 100 people there were no 10 copies of newspaper. There was no 2 radio sets for 100 people, and there was no 2 cinema seats for 100 people. So, that was a kind of a benchmark. That means many underdeveloped countries, those who were eager to develop, they took this norm as something that they wanted to achieve. And there have been many efforts from the developing countries to achieve this: 10 newspaper per 100 people, 2 radio sets per 100 people, and 2 cinema seats for every 100 people. Now, with all these things at the backdrop, so this is the beginning of Genesis, the infrastructure was being laid, the people were being told that they should use communication to bring in development for their people. The scholars stepped in, and there were some very good definitions about development communication, and we will discuss about some of these definitions. Let us start with the first and quite fundamental and quite popular definition of Nora Kebrel in 1975. Now, Nora Kebrel was closely associated with International Rice Research Institute in Los Baños campus of the University of the Philippines. She undertook many projects, particularly in the sector of agriculture, and she conducted campaigns also. And so, she had an insight as to what development communication can do and how it should be treated, and what should the philosophy of development communication be. So, I am quoting her now. She wrote that development communication is the art and science of human communication applied to the speedy transformation of a country and the mass of its people from poverty to a dynamic state of economic growth that makes possible greater social equality and larger fulfillment of human potential. There are some key words in it, let me point out. She said that it is art and science. That means a lot of creativity should get into it in development communication when we are making programs or when we are packaging messages. So, creativity is involved, that is why it is art. Now, she is also saying that it is science, because it has to follow certain principles, certain rules, certain regulations of making these packages and developing the messages. So, she calls development communication as art and science, and then she talks about the transformation, that means one state to another state of the people. So, they were traditionalists, they were in an underdeveloped state, but through communication they could be transformed, they could be taken to another level where poverty will be something of the past, there will be dynamism among people, there will be economic growth, that is what she says. And she also talks about greater social equality and larger fulfillment of human potential. Now, every human being has got certain kind of potential which we must nurture to have its full growth, and she talks about it. It's quite a potent, it's quite a strong definition. So, let me repeat once more. Development communication is the art and science of human communication applied to the speedy transformation of a country and the mass of its people from the poverty to a dynamic state of economic growth that makes possible greater social equality and the larger fulfillment of human potential. With this, this was something that I am sure all the development communication students as well as scholars are familiar with, and they must have analyzed each word of this definition. The second very strong definition we get is from Everett Rogers in 1983. He says that development communication refers to the uses to which communication is put in order to further development. Such applications are intended to either further development in a general way, such as increasing the level of mass media exposure among a nation's citizen in order to create a favorable climate for development or to support development programs or projects. The key word that Everett Rogers talks about, or the phrase, is to create a favorable climate. That means the mentally people are to be prepared to accept the developmental messages. So, that means a lot of discussion about development, about the various issues that would require attention of the policy makers, and if we do that one, then mentally, psychologically, people will be ready to accept something that the new things that would be coming to the society. So, Everett Rogers also put in his contribution in defining what development communication is, and the aspect that he highlighted was that development communication should be there to create a favorable climate, psychological climate, to create also the physical climate, so that people would be accepting the development messages. The third definition, which is quite famous, popular, and talks a lot about development communication, is of Rosario Braid. She says that development communication is an element of the management process in the overall planning and implementation of development programs. So, she talks about the managerial aspect. So, she talks that talks about the process that is involved in development communication. That means development communication will have to be planned, then it has to be implemented, and it has to be evaluated. These are the three cornerstones of management: planning, implementation, and evaluation. And Rosario Braid talks about that. So, development communication is a managerial process. That means creating the climate, as Everett Rogers has said, and also art and science that Nora Cabral has mentioned. Now, so from this, from these three definitions and earlier work of Lerner and Wilbraham, and also the contribution of United Nations, what we find is that development communication is purposive. That means development communication, when we package the messages and we put it in the form of communication to the audiences, it should have a purpose. It must have objectives to achieve. Second point that we can deduce from all this discussion is that development communication is positive. That means, if you listen to the messages, if you implement the messages and if you create your mental frame in such a way that you are going to accept something new that is coming to the society, you are going to get positive results. That is why it is called positive. And the third one, development communication, is pragmatic, it is practical, it does not talk in the air. There is already a very laid out format, step by step one has to proceed and achieve whatever the development communication messages would be giving to the audience. So, overall development communication, though as I have said that it was a weapon of the USA to spread the message of development and thereby influence the audiences to be in the fold of America or thinking like the American way of life. So, that is how they started. We get the seminal book of Daniel Lerner, Passing of the Traditional Society, his work that he did in Balgard village. And then we have found that Wilbur Sham also stepped in with his book that was published in 1964, and then United Nations stepping in, giving some norms. For every 10 people there should be 10 newspapers, 2 cinema seats and 2 radio sets. And after that we have discussed the definition of Nora Cabral, that is his basic philosophy, foundational approach in it. Then we talked about Rogers' definition, and at the end we talked about the Rosario Braid's definition. So, altogether this is the background of development communication. We can go further into it and we can get some more material and enrich ourselves. So, thank you very much for this overview that you have listened to, and I am sure you will be digging further into the aspects of development communication, the philosophy of development communication, and also how it has progressed around the world. Thank you for being with us.